and welcome to this week's Hocus Focus. I'm Sara Mondaini.
And I'm Thomas Sheridan.
And thanks once again for joining us and letting us be part of your Sunday night strangeness. And don't forget, we've got the live chat open again, so please feel free to delve into that. And a big thank you to everyone who watches and supports us, because it's you guys that make our show possible.
Yeah, thanks again, everybody. I haven't even seen last week's show because I've been so busy. I'm sure it's good. I'll get a look at it this week. But I did have a quick look and the numbers were great and the chat was flying. And that's what we wanted. We're very happy with that.
I've got a small confession to make about last week's show, seeing as you've not seen it, Thomas. I spelt Bermuda wrong. And
I got the director of the Secret of Roninish wrong. I always get John Singleton and John Sayles mixed up because they were both big stars in Hollywood. Well, they were kind of up-and-coming stars in Hollywood at the same time and made similar films. And so I got the two of them mixed up. So it's John Sayles who made The Secret of Roninish.
And it's Bermuda, spelt with an E, not a U, and I do apologise about that. That's the spell checking and the autocorrect on the computer. Apologies.
Well, we're a home operation here. We're not... we don't have the interns we can scream abuse at.
No, we just scream at each other when we make mistakes.
Yet we don't have them.
Our first topic tonight is ghost ships, which conjures up those mysteries of ships that have been around, that have been found abandoned at sea with no people on them, and everything's still and eerie, as though the people have just disappeared into thin air. Now, I always think that the oceans and seas are very supernatural places, and although they are in this world, I don't think they're actually of it. And when you step onto a ship and go out to sea, you're at its mercy, like it's some kind of sleeping monster with a gaping mouth. And if it awakens for any reason, it has no regard for how splendid or opulent your ship might be. And if it wants to take you, it'll take you. And I also believe that when you go out to sea, you're almost in another realm, another reality where the laws and fabric of reality are different to that of the land. And you are, in effect, a guest in another realm. And long times spent at sea have been said to change a person, especially explorers and sailors, many finding that they can't lose their sea legs when back on land, and they find it hard to adapt, and they long to be back at sea. Now, the sea, I think, has the ability to possess people who spend great lengths of time on it, or if not possess, then it can certainly cast a spell over people. And there are many mysteries of ghost ships over many, many hundreds of years, and the most famous and well-known one being the Mary Celeste. But before we bring that ghost ship into the discussion, I want to bring in a different type of ghost ship. Not so much a ghost ship, but a famous ship that is full of ghosts, and that is the Queen Mary. So the Queen Mary was part of the Cunard White Star Line, and she was christened on the 26th of September 1934, and she carried the wealthy across the Atlantic until her retirement in 1967. And for a while, she dominated transatlantic travel and held the Blue Riband from 1938 to 1952, which is an unofficial accolade given to passenger liners crossing the Atlantic Ocean in regular service with the record highest average speed. She was the luxury cruise liner, always full of celebrities and politicians and royalty and full of money. But when the decadence aboard the ship came to an abrupt end, it was when World War II started. And the glitz and the glam of the rich and famous were dropped, and she then became a military transport ship who carried thousands of soldiers across the world. And that's when things took a rather dark turn. There are said to have been at least 49 deaths on board from the time of her being a military ship, and that in itself has caused many psychic imprints from the deaths that have occurred on board, and has resulted, it's said, in over 100 spirits that are said to stalk the ship to this very day. Now, there are many reported ghost sightings and strange activity by passengers, the hotel staff, and guests, which caused parts of the ship to be closed off from the public. The Queen Mary is now a hotel / tourist attraction, and it's cited as one of the most haunted destinations in the USA. Now, back in 1966, a young crew member named John Pedder was crushed by a door during an emergency drill. And another man was said to have died after drinking cleaning fluid because he thought it was gin. And the rest of the ship's dead died of natural causes. And what caused the most death was because the Queen Mary was pushed to maximum capacity, and 15,000 soldiers were crammed into spaces that were designed for around only 2,000 passengers. And that created a living hell where many of the soldiers were crushed or died from heat exhaustion, or they simply jumped ship because of the appalling conditions. After the war, she was renovated and filled with Art Deco designs and luxuries, and she was ready for life as a cruise liner again. But nothing could seem to get rid of the stain of all the death, and she was officially declared a haunted ship. She retired in 1967 and was sold to the Long Beach authorities, where she eventually became a hotel. In 1948, a third-class passenger named Walter J. Adamson mysteriously died on board. Nobody knows how he died, whether it was from natural causes or if he was killed by a ghost already on board. And also in 1966, another passenger staying in the same cabin said that her bed covers were pulled off by a man who was stood at the foot of her bed, who vanished soon afterwards. Another story claims that staff had locked a man in his cabin after he'd murdered 2 women, again in the 60s. And during the night, he began beating on the door, screaming to the guard outside that something was in the room with him. When they opened the door in the morning, they found him ripped apart and dead. Another report of 3 maids who were cleaning the ballroom in 1989 when the ship was a hotel. All 3 of them saw a man sat in a chair on the dance floor, and one of them asked the man to leave so they could clean it. And at that point, all 3 women witnessed him vanish into thin air. There's also been reports of knockings on the doors in the middle of the night, lights turning on and off, taps being turned on and off, bed covers being pulled off after the maids have made the beds. And around the area where the first-class pool is, there have been many, many sightings, including a lady in a tennis skirt, a lady in an old-fashioned wedding gown, and a cloud of steam that appears from nowhere with a little girl in a blue dress who was said to have drowned in the pool in the 1950s. Today, it's a haunted attraction where you can book a tour around the ship, although the tours only take place during the day and they refuse to do them at night. So ghost ships are not only those that have been found deserted, but there are also actual ships that are haunted, just like houses can be. And there's also a movie just been released about the Queen Mary. It's a bit like The Shining in that it follows the stories of 2 families who board the ship in different time eras. One family is from the ship's heyday in the 30s, and the other from today, who visit the ship as a haunted tourist attraction. And they become connected through the time differences because they're both victims of the entities and they're trapped inside the ocean liner. And even the film crew said they experienced a lot of supernatural activity while they were making the movie, and they were told they couldn't go to certain parts of the ship due to the renovations that were taking place. But something kept leaving wet footprints in the cordoned off areas, which got the film crew into trouble as they were accused of being where they were told not to be. And the lights would flicker on and off in response to yes and no questions from the film crew. So maybe we could review that film in a future episode, Thomas.
Yeah, I love what you said there about the sea being a different realm. It definitely does alter your consciousness and changes it in a different way. I think that's why I've been enjoying. I'll now tend to take a ship overnight when I'm going from Ireland to the UK rather than fly. I like sleeping in the cabin on my own in perfect solitude. To the ship rocking, I almost feel like a baby in the womb or something. And I like to get up at night and walk out onto the ship and in the middle of the Irish Sea and look around me. And how can it not change your consciousness? You imagine sailing across the Pacific in the olden days on an old sailing boat, and below you is thousands and thousands of feet of the Pacific right down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. It's another domain, another realm that's just as terrifying, mysterious, and dangerous as outer space above you in the sky. So how could you not be affected by that? How could you not be affected by the sensation of sleeping while the ship is movement? And if you're doing that for all your life, I would find it very difficult to come back home and sleep in a bed in a house that didn't rock. Another thing too is you kind of understand there's a kind of a demonic element in some parts of the sea. When I was and this happened to me twice now, when I was coming into Belfast and once into Liverpool, massive cruise ships, and these things are like skyscrapers, the height of them, and they look evil and demonic, and there's something wicked and disturbing about them. And the last one I saw in Belfast had a gigantic video screen on the top where people were watching videos, but it was the size of a cinema screen. It looked so unnatural being in the sea, looking like this, and painted all this garish colors with all these garish lights all over it. It just oozed this horrible energy. It was almost like a profane violation of the ocean and the sea and stuff like that. Now, regarding the ghosting, haunting thing, I find it fascinating that the Queen Mary is haunted and it's been moored, well, landlocked, well, not moored, but, in the same port for decades now. You don't hear an awful lot of stories about haunted ships on the sea, as if it needs to be stabilized in order for, it could easily be something like jinns have taken over the Queen Mary in Long Beach or something like that. But there was this one guy who used to live up the road from me here. His name is Nick, and he's an English guy, and he used to work for BP on tankers in the old days, back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And these enormous tankers going from the UK, Britain down to through the Suez Canal down to the Persian Gulf. But he sailed all over the world with these things. And he said, and he was an officer, but he said they'd often get reports of weird events on board the ship. Like they would see lights that would just appear. And that was a very worrying thing on an oil tanker, because if that's a flame and you have this massive amount of gas above the oil, you could have a horrific explosion. But he said you'd see strange lights at sea. And also you might be walking down a long corridor at night and you'll hear footsteps behind you and there's nobody there. And the deeper you go into the ocean, he said, the stranger things get. And one time in the middle of the Pacific, he saw huge lights moving slowly under the sea, like really bright lights down a couple of 100 feet that was moving under the sea below him, diagonally to what the ship was moving. And he said that there's something about the sea that does change you, because he found it very difficult to get back on land. And he came from a time when it was a real seafaring tradition. It actually meant something to be in the merchant marine or something like that, or a navy. And I always remember telling me that stories that there would be weird lights and weird feelings and weird sensations. He said your whole mindset would change. But he said he found it very hard to be creative. He used to like to write, and he said I found it hard to write at sea. I would write when I'd come back to land. He said it was like a place of few words and few thoughts, and he just kind of accepted this realm, as you called it, for what it is. I'm not surprised at all that it affects people that way. It's affected me that way in the 8 or 9 trips I've taken in recent years by sea overnight, to the point where I'm going to find it really hard to fly again over a short distance. I want to take the ship. It has changed me, and it's very meditative. There's a meditative quality to it. And like you said, you're at the mercy of the sea. Anything could be down there, from a whale to an old World War II sea mine that is still floating around waiting to hit a ship and blow up. And or an iceberg or another ship or something. But I think tonight's theme of the show is definitely, maritime ontology. You mentioned the Marie Celeste there in your opening monologue. I'd like to talk about that for a bit because it's fascinated me. Do you have any your own theories or feelings on that? And explain what it is to people who don't might not know what it is.
Yeah, well, it was a ship that took a voyage on November the 7th, 1872, and it had 7 crew members aboard, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs and his wife Sarah and the 2-year-old daughter Sophia. It was a massive ship, 282 tons, and it was facing really rough weather for the 2 weeks that the journey was to arrive at the Azores. And it was here that the ship's last log entry was recorded at 5 a.m. on November the 25th. And another ship called the De Grazia or Della Grazia, De Grazia, was coming past and noticed the ship, and the captain of the De Grazia was actually friends with the captain of the Marie Celeste, so he recognized the ship, and they went over to have a look if everything was all right. Was the ship in distress? When they got on board, they found that there was nobody there. No, everybody had disappeared. Nobody there. They also noticed that there was some water coming in as well, and coming in from the bottom. And the ship had, I think it was 1,700 barrels of alcohol on board that they were carrying. They're not sure something had happened to do with carrying this alcohol, and they may have gone off in a lifeboat because one of the lifeboats was missing. So they could have gone in a lifeboat and perished at sea. But the strange thing with the story is that when they went back to land and they went back to the Maritime, I don't know the name, the Maritime Society, to explain what they'd found, the judge actually thought that there'd been some foul play and that the people of the De Grazia had murdered the occupants of the Marie Celeste to steal the alcohol and whatnot that was on board. So piracy, yeah. So they got looked into, the rescue boat, the De Grazia, but they found no foul play there. So I think each member of the De Grazia got a 10, the value of what was rescued from the ship, but nobody knows where the people went. There was tales of mutiny. There was all the usual theories coming up about the captain was supposed to have been a tyrant and he wasn't very nice, and the crew turned on him, and all these kinds of things. It fell apart. It was just hearsay and trying to make a story out of it. So they just disappeared. And what do I think it is? Well, the fact that the lifeboat disappeared, that had gone, I just think that they'd gone into some trouble with the water coming through the bottom of the ship, and it's possible that they went off in the lifeboat and perished. To have what the sea wants.
Another theory I have about that is it was carrying industrial alcohol, which has very strong fumes from it. It may have affected them to the point where they weren't thinking straight. Now, regarding the water coming in, that's the failed ballast pumps, probably. All ships have ballast pumps on them to pump water out. All ships leak, basically. But they also use that water to help balance them. It's called ballast. So that's why these stories you often see in, like, ship was floating at sea for 10, 20 years has been found, and it can't happen because the ballast pumps are switched off and it'll sink within a few weeks. So that was probably what the water was. I wonder if some kind of madness set in. Because it seemed very orderly how they left. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of panic. It could be some kind of poisoning. I've heard these stories of people getting lead poisoning on these ships from cans. This lead salt are used on them, and they all go bonkers together. And there's often some very strange stories like that. But at the same time too, it's a very unusual thing for a man with his wife get into a boat with his wife and young baby and all his crew, unless things are really, really bad. The ship has to be really sinking. The ship has to be on fire. Something really, really bad. And the ship was it was able working order, other than the ballast pumps had not been used, so it filled up with water. So I often wonder if something spooked them and made them run. Something on a ship spooked them. And also the thing of the captain being a tyrant, that could also suggest that there was some kind of psychiatric problem there, that he was probably unstable in some, and these fumes from the ship may have exacerbated it. But quite a few ships have been found with the crew missing, floating at sea. The Mary Celeste is not the only one. The Mary Celeste has been made very famous by the publicity it got back in the day. It was like heavily covered in these penny dreadful newspapers and all this kind of sensational stuff. And it was, but there's been lots of stories of ships where the crews just left and nobody knew why. And it's almost like, is there something that happens on the ship that makes them all leave out of fear or terror or something like that?
There's another one here. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. The Caluche. It's Caleuche. It's Chilean. And in Chilota mythology, there's a story about a ghost ship which materializes every night near the island, an island just off the coast of Chile. And the legend goes that this ghost ship carries the spirits of all the people who have ever drowned at sea. And the ship's supposed to be this beautiful big ship that's brightly lit with all kind of festoon lights, and it's literally a perpetual party with the sounds of party music and laughter coming from it, and it only stays for a few moments and then it disappears again, or it'll submerge itself under the water. And apparently 3 Chilota water spirits known as the Sirena Chilota, the Pincoya, and the Pecoy, who look like mermaids, and they're around the seas, and they're the ones who go and collect the spirits of anybody who's drowned in the sea and bring them to the party ship, where they then spend the rest of eternity on this party ship.
Now, the thing of life and death is fascinating because old time seamen had a heaven and a hell. The heaven was called Fiddler's Green, where old seamen went if they were, if they don't, where they go to if they were good people. And it was basically their life on the sea brought into an afterlife, but there was no storms. The wind always blew the sails. There was always good sailing. It was a happy place, a happy sea. And then there was a thing called Davy Jones' Locker, which was you would go to the bottom of the sea and be imprisoned there, and like with the crabs eating you alive and all that stuff, and this kind of thing. So they even have their own kind of form of spirituality in that way when you think about it.
And the sea has also, I think, got its own laws as well, its own natural laws. They were filled with thieves and kidnappers, just like the land. You had pirates, mercenaries, and the maritime world was always like a haven for criminals and salty sailors. Oh, because a lot of sailors from the olden days all seem to have issues. They were all quite angry men, very salty, wouldn't stand any nonsense from the crew. These sorts of pirates and things frequently attack and get on vessels and leave them adrift and abandoned, and crew members might have been killed or kidnapped or just left to their own devices on a drifting ship with no food or water. And I suppose if you're left on a ship kind of at the mercy of the elements and you got no water, like water everywhere and not a drop to drink, eventually the insanity would set in, wouldn't it? And you'd probably throw yourself overboard just to make it stop.
You know what film really has a fantastic representation of the hauntology of old sea times is Master and Commander with Russell Crowe. That film got slated by the critics when it first came out, and it's absolutely a magnificent movie. It's basically set in the Napoleonic Wars, and Russell Crowe is the captain. I think his name is something like Captain Jack, of this British naval ship that's pursuing a French ship during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, at the very end, there's an awful violent battle that's quite horrific, but it's a very realistic battle. But the film, up until that point, it gives a really deep ontological vibe to the whole, what it was like sailing back then and in the seas and going around the Cape and all this. It's tremendously romantic and frightening at the same time. But it's almost like you're watching. I mean, I honestly don't know why this film was slated by the critics, because it's just wonderful, and it just captured that whole hauntological feeling that I was talking about at the beginning. But yeah, so that I'd recommend, if you want to see a film that really captures that energy of the sea, Master and Commander is a fantastic film for that. Of course, there's also the thing of Charon and the ferryman bringing the people across the River Styx to the afterlife. And why is the river involved in that? The river, again, the ancient Greeks saw the waterway as a passageway between different realms, like you said at the beginning.
Well, last week we talked about portals, and it's quite possible that areas of the sea are portals to other realms, and so things can come in and out of it. And also, is it where the gods reside, and every now and again they require a sacrifice? And
yeah, it's not just Poseidon, it's all kinds of animism and everything connected to it. Yeah, absolutely, I do believe that. I always felt strongly that way since the time I was a child, walking on the beach under the full moon, that there was something under the. When you stand at the beach and you look at the sea in daytime, you don't get the same impression that you do when you look at it at nighttime. When you look at the sea at nighttime under a full moon, it's really beautiful, but you completely have a different conscious awareness of it because you're seeing the blackness of it, and you know that you're peering into some kind of abyss.
And when you're in a coastal town at night, you feel that energy from the sea. It feels different. Walking around a coastal town at night feels different to walking around a regular town at night. You feel the sea. It's hard to explain, but you feel it. Kind of feel
Yeah,
it in your bones. It's the strange. You're aware of it all the time, even if you can't see it. You know you're near it, and it's.
yeah. Around here, you hear the stones churning under the waves. The waves churn the stones around, and they sound like drums playing under the ocean. And then, like, you'll be intermittently. Sometimes you'll hear like the dolphins at night singing and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly mystical, incredibly mystical.
And also seafarers and people who work on the sea, they're some of the most superstitious people on the planet, and perhaps that's because when you're at the mercy of the sea, when you're out there in the middle of it and you're at the mercy of it, the line between life and death is very thin, and that might accentuate a person's nervous system and then attract all sorts of supernatural activity as a result of that, or all sorts of entities, sort of similar to, I would say, having an out of body experience, but you're still in your body, stood kind of at the borderland between this world and the next world, or life and death.
And why do they always have an obsession with making knots? It's almost like they're making sigils and ropes. Do you ever see a book or a list of all the knots that sailors and seamen make? They seem incredibly overcomplicated, these knotting systems. It was even shown in The Secret of Rowan Innes. Eamon, little boy Eamon, was making different knots and showing to Fiona, she had to name them. These knots are almost like sigils. And in, like things like Finnish magic, not rope is considered a very powerful medium for the creation of talismans and sigils. So I often wonder if that went back to Viking times. They were sitting there making some kind of sigil in a rope, and that became the tradition of seamen having to know how to make every single rope type knot.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's possible, perhaps going back to the olden days, that maybe certain knots protected you from certain entities.
Yeah, I think that there could be a lot of truth to that. Or, they were actually like holy metals or something, especially in, say, Protestant countries where you wouldn't have had like religious medals. Maybe the knots represented some kind of thing like that. There was tremendous superstition, and the knots could have been originally sigils of some kind.
So you're talking about the knots and different types of knots and possibly being different types of talismans. And we've talked about how superstitious a lot of seafarers are. I don't know if people have ever wondered why a boat is launched by smashing a bottle of champagne on its bow, but that tradition or superstition, if you like, goes back to the time of the Vikings when they launched a longboat. The story goes that they tied the prisoners to the skids, so the boats crushed the bodies as they slid into the water. And much later, more modern shipbuilders had tied red ribbons to the nails on the skids as a substitute. And then wine would also represent the blood in later days. But because launching a ship was such a big event, they went from wine to champagne because that was considered to be much more festive and prestigious. So it went from the bodies of prisoners to red ribbons to bottles of red wine to champagne.
And then in mythology, you have like the Iliad and Homer and the Odyssey and Jason and the Argonauts, all basically the same idea of a ship leaving to go to the world of the gods. The ship is not actually going, it's going out to sea, but it's going to be among the gods. And I find that very fascinating too, because it's like the ship represents the dive inside the subconscious of the individual involved. In the case of the Iliad, Ulysses in Homer's Odyssey. But ever since humans have taken to the sea on boats, it seems a profound mythology has developed around it.
I think that there's as much mystery and vastness in the sea as there is in space.
And it's also easier to get into space than it is to get to the bottom of the ocean. It's actually easier and safer to build a rocket that gets you into space than it is to build a submersible to get you to the bottom of the ocean, because the pressure, you don't have the problem in space with the tremendous pressure and all this kinds of thing weighing down on you. And that's, even the bottom of the Marianas Trench, that's only been recently, I think, been looked at. And that's why they use robots. But that's the irony of it, that human beings got into space before they got to the bottom of the ocean. And if that's a sobering thought that people need to always remind themselves of when looking out to sea.
Out up into space and down at the bottom of the sea are two places that I've never, even if I would have had the chance to do that, which is impossible. It's just two places I've never had the passion to ever consider wanting to venture down there.
I'd be terrified by the sheer weight and enormity of the weight above me in the darkness and the cold. And likewise, if I looked down on the earth from space and saw like countries like Britain and Ireland and America and all places I recognized, it terrified the hell out of me.
Yeah, and just like William Shatner said, the blackness all around.
That's because they flew up in daytime and you don't see the stars in space in daytime.
Yeah.
So you got a false impression. That's why there's no stars in the Apollo pictures. It's daytime.
He said he'd never seen so much blackness and he never wanted to see that again.
But ironically, that blackness was caused by the brilliance of the sun. Yes. So maybe he needs to be a little bit more philosophical.
So that wraps up our segment on ghost ships. What are your thoughts on ghost ships? Have we got any viewers who work in the maritime industry who've had any unusual encounters? Perhaps you have your own theories about some of the ghost ships discussed tonight. Remember, this show isn't about telling you what we unequivocally think something is or isn't. This show is about throwing ideas around and discussing those ideas open-mindedly. And some of the ghost ships will have a more rational explanation than others. But as we say so many times on this show, until something is 100% shown, then all possibilities stay on the table. For this week's folk horror, we are reviewing John Carpenter's 1980 film, The Fog. It's a classic supernatural horror set against the backdrop of a small coastal town in Northern California called Antonio Bay, which is about to celebrate its centennial anniversary. However, as the town prepares for its festivities, a mysterious fog rolls in from the sea, carrying some vengeful spirits that are looking for retribution for a secret that was buried within the town's history. You've got Adrienne Barbeau's sultry voice throughout the film as the radio DJ, who gives a relaxing late-night narrative element. And as the film goes on, she realises there's something terribly wrong, so she uses the airwaves to warn others. Jamie Lee Curtis is in the film, and as we know, she was in Carpenter's Halloween, and so seeing her in this adds a nice touch to the spookiness too. Although this was a young Curtis and not the Curtis we see today with a loud voice promoting a certain ideology within Hollywood. And the film starts on the eve of the festivities and paranormal activity starts happening all over the town and nobody knows why. And the town priest, Father Malone, finds his grandfather's diary when a breeze block explodes and the journal's found hidden behind the wall. And Father Malone reads that a century earlier, in 1880, the 6 founding fathers of Antonio Bay, one of which was Malone's granddad, deliberately wrecked a ship named the Elizabeth Dane. And they did that to prevent the owner of the ship, Blake, who had leprosy, from building a leper colony in the town. And so the 6 Antonio Bay founders stole the gold taken from the shipwreck to establish this new town. And as the fog envelopes the town, the spirits of Blake and his crew terrorise the residents, and they've come back to kill 6 people, which is symbolic of the 6 men who wrecked their ship. And throughout the film, we see the deaths of 5 people. And eventually, the local radio DJ, Stevie, advises everyone to head to the town's church through her broadcast. And they find a gold cross in the wall cavity made from the rest of the stolen gold. And Father Malone offers the spirits the gold as well as himself in order to spare the others. And Blake seizes the gold cross, and him and his crew disappear in a flash of light, and the fog also vanishes. But is that the end of the nightmare? The tension in the film is built up through its visuals, and it's got a real atmospheric musical score composed by Carpenter himself, and his music is composed in such a way that it becomes a narrative for the scenes. And the misty coastal settings that he used build up this sense of isolation and being trapped and vulnerable to the fog and Blake and his ghostly crew. And it's kind of a slow burn horror film that keeps you on the edge, especially as the night falls in and the fog slowly starts to roll in. Another interesting aspect is that it covers something that Thomas and I write about in our upcoming book. It goes into the town's history and the sins of its forefathers, giving the town an element of the deep town, what we refer to as places that have psychic imprints upon them from past history, which can have an effect on certain inhabitants today, as well as attracting a certain type of person to these towns. There's a few jump scares in the film, but nothing too gratuitous. There's lots of suspense, feeling trapped, and car wheels getting stuck in the mud. One scene was of the weatherman from the local weather station who'd give the weather to the radio DJ Stevie. And he wasn't really a nice guy, bit of a skeptic and a bit lechy with the DJ. And when she was warning him on the phone to be careful, as there's something not right with the fog, he just laughs and accuses her of being uptight and how he has something that can fix that. And it's at that point that the film's resident debunker and realist gets, shall we say, a good taste of the reality he was writing off as nonsense. It's a great film, I think, that catches the hauntology of the sea perfectly. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. And if you have seen it, it's certainly worth another watch.
And there's the reason why The Fog, when it first came out, was trashed by the critics. It was really looked down upon. I was in school when it came out, went to see it with some of my friends from school, and they didn't like it. They thought it was silly, and I thought it was great. It's now in the years since a long time ago now, 1980, since then, the film now has a huge cult following. And I think you nailed why it has a huge cult following, because it was made before hauntology. And now with hauntology and people being so much aware of this kind of thing of towns having stories and energies and feelings and psychological, geographic profiles, that now we see Antonio Bay very much in that deep town thing. Another thing that I took from watching it the other night was how the fog itself and the fear of it could have echoed the Rona, like the scene where the doors open and they're trying to get the little boy upstairs. So the fog doesn't touch him because the monsters, the ghosts, whatever they are, ghost zombies, pirates live in the fog. So it's almost like that. There was a kind of parallel there where people been terrified of the Rona in recent years, and locking themselves indoors. Everyone had to lock themselves indoors. So like the John Carpenter's movies have a funny way of developing new narratives in them as time progresses. I believe he wrote the story. Well, he was inspired for the story of the fog when he was visiting Stonehenge in England in the late 70s, and a fog was moving across a Salisbury Plain. And he had also seen a film called The Curse of the Trollenberg or something like that from the 50s, which was about monsters living inside fog. So that's what that inspired him to write a story, The Fog. Now, it's a very Lovecraftian kind of story. It's set on the sea. It's in the lighthouse involved and all this stuff, but it's in California, Northern California, rather than in New England and Maine or New Hampshire, or Connecticut, or somewhere like that, in Massachusetts. So, but it still has its own kind of lovely energy about it. I love the concept of Adrian Barbeau as the DJ, being kind of like the voice of hope, using the radio station. That was very well done. And again, John Carpenter's synthesizer soundtracks is just fantastic. Yes, it's a film that when I first saw it as a kid, I thought it was great for kiddie kind of things, like who doesn't like Ghost Pirates? My friends hated it, but now, and a lot of people trashed it when it first came out, but now they all love it. And also the theme of, you say again, back to the deep town thing, the concept of the Antonio Bay paying for the sins of its founding fathers by murdering these men on a ship in order to build her town, as a very powerful and deep kind of idea too as well. And the ghost pirates coming back on the centenary of the town. Yeah, it's a great film. It's a very entertaining. And the fact that it's a slow burner doesn't distract from it. It actually makes it better for that reason.
I thought it was kind of on a parallel with poltergeist activity, in the sense that the sins of the forefathers, if you like, in this film, what went on in the past, came back to haunt the residents of now. And that's like with the deep towns that are below the hinterlands that are surrounding them, with all the mill towns from the last couple of 100 years, and all the things that went on there in the farmhouses before the mill towns. And then you had the mill towns, and then all that was squashed, and then they put the new council estates on, and then all that history that was squashed kind of reappeared years and years later in certain houses as poltergeist activity and haunted houses, and it affected some people and not others. And I thought that film was kind of on a level with that sort of thing, but instead of just affecting one or two houses on a street, it affected the whole town.
Those kind of fishing towns are quite dysfunctional places too. There's lots of alcoholism and there's huge divorce rates. You say the fisherman has like 4 or 5 ex-wives and this kind of thing. It's a very difficult life. You can make a lot of money quickly or lose a lot of money quickly, and a lot of addictions problems, social problems, and these kind of all. I know your theory of the deep town is that the family is dysfunctional, and we see that with like the Enfield poltergeist, that it resurrects the entities buried below back to the surface through a dysfunctional family. Same thing could happen in these towns, that the dysfunctionality of the past comes to the surface. And you definitely get that in a lot of those old seaside, no fishing towns, that energy about them, that there's a bit spooky, and they've got, like even the ones that are real picturesque, like Mousel and Cornwall, which is famous for like the Mousel cat story, and that had some terrible tragedies there too. I think when like back in the 1970s, of fishermen going down, and also these towns are raided by not Ottoman, Moorish pirates, and during the Barbary Wars and stuff like that, where whole towns were depopulated and taken off as slaves. So they were not easy places to live, not by any means. But I think that's John Carpenter. I don't think I've made any film like it. It's almost like the Birds kind of was on that. Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds kind of had that feeling about it, especially the scene where the woman says, you brought the pain here, you brought the suffering here, whatever, this kind of thing. That had that thought, but I think he took it one stage level further with The Fog. Yeah, I really enjoyed The Fog, seeing it again for the first time in many years, reviewing it for this show, and I have to say one of its attributes is that slow burn, is that slow pace, because it gets your mind thinking in between the pauses and so on. To like, I think that's what made the film a cult film over the years since it came out, is because it allows a sense of introspection. The film has that nature about it.
It also makes you wonder, when you said about the coastal, some of these coastal towns are quite dysfunctional. Going back to the sea again, does it put some kind of a spell on certain people, the sea? Does the sea attract a certain type of person? We laugh about salty sailors, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of like you say, issues there. A lot of them are very, very angry. Well, certainly of old times, quite angry and they don't stand any nonsense. They
Well,
like a drink.
but even without that, I live by a big surfing community, and I can tell you that depression and suicide is very high among surfers. It's the strangest thing. Like you meet them all, they're all really nice people and everything, and seem like all the surfers happy guys, but so many of them seem to suffer from depression, and there's been quite a lot of suicides as well. So it's like, they talk about the sea as a cruel mistress. It seems to be that in every way.
And is it a certain type of person that it affects? Is it not everybody? I don't know. Is it the
Yeah.
iodine levels?
Or ions, negative and positive ions. They always talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, the sea always looks great from the shore, and I mean, I'd like to live beside the sea. I think it'd be quite nice, but I think I'd like to live inland from it, looking down towards it rather than on the coast. Yeah, and I've known people from New England fishing villages, and they're quite feral. That's the only way I could describe them. There's something kind of animalistic about them. Uh, both the males and the females, they're quite primal in how they think and behave. There's a wildness there that borders on sinister, I'd say. There's girls from seaside, those New England seaside towns, they can be pretty wild, even when they're older and stuff like that, and very promiscuous and very feral, so it seems to affect people in a very intensive way, like it amplifies all the qualities that some may already exist in someone.
It's almost like perhaps that some certain people take on the qualities or the characteristics of the sea. They live around that energy, so they take that energy on, and they become that. They become
Yeah.
that environment. They become the personification of that environment in some cases. So they become wild and crazy.
Well, in the old days, say a seaport like Gloucester, Massachusetts, you have the concept of the Widow's Walk, right? And the Widow's Walk was a place that they were built on the front of the house overlooking the sea, where the widow would pace up and down until her husband came back from sea, if he came back at all. That's why they called it the Widow's Walk. And you can actually visit historic houses in Gloucester and places like Peabody in Massachusetts, and see where the floorboards have been actually worn down by women walking back and forth, worry about their husbands. And then when the Victorian age ended, these women, rather than actually waiting for their husbands they sort of started having affairs with men in the town. And I think that's what kind of like caused the wildness to come in there, that the Victorian rules imposed upon these seafaring towns broke down, and that's what happened. Like they went feral and wild in their own kind of way, and they were definitely sort of like, from what I gather, liberated long before the hippie days came along. It was just the culture that developed. There was a wildness to it. But there's also lots of problems today with meth and things like that. So they are very much in the genre of the deep town. And I think, the Antonio Bay in the film The Fog was kind of a little idealistic. It was a bit too nice, and also in films like Jaws, Amenity Island, the way they portrayed the film was has to make its money during the summer months, and it's willing to sacrifice tourists to a shark in order to keep the shops and businesses open during the summer, so they don't end up on welfare in the winter. So even that, it's they're living on a knife edge all the time. And yeah, I mean, and I think The Fog if there's one criticism of The Fog that I have, even the girl, Jamie Lee Curtis, when the guy picked her up, they get it on immediately that night. That's like what they're like, just very promiscuous, and I think if The Fog has any failing, it didn't show the town gritty enough. It showed it a little bit too respectable.
Yeah, I wondered about that scene. He picked her up on the road, didn't he? And the next thing you know, it was like they'd been in a relationship for 5 months, and it was the same night.
Yeah, that's what they like. That's what those New England villages are like. Sea towns are like. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they were stuck together like glue throughout the rest of the film. Like they'd known each other all their lives, not 5 minutes. That
Yeah, and you see, and that's a legacy of women's husbands going to sea and never knowing they're coming back or not. So they sort of gave up at one point and said, like, I'll take a relationship instantaneously, wherever I can find it. And then you have the thing also, and this is getting quite dark actually. But in the olden days, you would have had men bringing back tropical STDs into these towns, and you may be dealing with. I'm not. If you live in the New England seaport, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying the possibility of hereditary STDs that are actually affected in the behaviors of the cis culture. I mean, even in Lovecraft's the Shadow over Innsmouth, he brings back a foreign wife from overseas, and it leads to a genetic deterioration, not deterioration, genetic change in the community. And this is like what happens basically. They're half fishes, but they came from the South Sea Islanders, and they were the protagonist within the story talks about how ugly and inbred looking they all look in the town as it's falling apart. And the only person in the town that makes any sense in the fishing port is the town's drunk. So their reputation is well established.
Do you think that kind of dysfunctionality stretches out to towns that are by ports, or is it just the actual seaside? Because in a town that's got a port, it's not really on the seaside, is it? It's
No,
different.
it,
It doesn't feel
it,
the same.
it's fishing. It's fishing ports. It's fishermen who own their own boat. Even there's a fantastic 1960s American sitcom called Dark Shadows, and it's wonderful. And it started out as a soap opera, and it's set in a fictional town of Collinsport in Maine, and it ends up having a great story about vampires and everything like that. But I mean, that was the biggest show in America back in its day, and it dealt with the dysfunctionality of a seaport town and a soap opera, but they put vampires and ghosts and witches and everything. It was brilliant, actually. And I've been watching them again on YouTube, and they're all on YouTube, and it's just like thousands of them, and it's amazing to think that they had this on daytime TV in America of like witchcraft and all this kind of stuff back in the 60s and vampires. It was brilliant. But that was set in a seaport town, about a family who were a fishing there's a cannery and a boatyard and all that stuff. And, and there's a real life place of that. It's a Bucksport in Maine, and on my Beyond Room 313 channel, I went there and did a short film on the place. And there's just all kinds. It's a beautiful place, a beautiful village now. But we're seeing them as they are now, in the 21st century, where they're tourist buildings and they're all painted up and nice. If you go look in old paintings like Charles Birchfield's paintings or old, even some of the Edward Hopper things, you can go back and look at these towns and they were not pristine, painted up bright, because the people were a lot poorer and there was no tourist industry. And that's the kind of town, that Lovecraft wrote about. There's one place called Peabody. It's near Boston, and it's full of amazingly historic buildings going back to 16 this and 17 that. And it's just one of the most intact historic towns I've ever been in. But the buildings are all freshly painted, and when that was all higgledy-piggledy, rustic, ramshackled, the atmosphere would have been tremendous. It would have been tremendous. And that would have been a perfect place for these kind of stories and ghosts and spirits and entities to gather.
That's put me in mind of Miami in Florida, which is also quite a big fishing, lots of fishermen there and fishing boats there in the harbour. And that is actually the murder capital of the US, Miami. It's got the highest murder rate. It did have, certainly in the 80s. Don't quote me now, I would need to look that up. But in the 80s, it certainly did. And that makes you wonder, is that to do with the element of the sea, and it attracts a certain type of person to that energy?
Yeah, it's possible. It was also a big drug dealing center because all the drugs in the Caribbean were coming through there. So that was a big part of the problem too, was the whole drug thing. Yeah, so I guess because again, it's a meeting point. It's a crossover point between realms: psychological, criminal, legal, social, psychological, political, cultural. That you have these things happen, and it's funny. Like Lovecraft had no connection with his family to any direct involvement in seafaring, yet nearly all the stories are about it. Which I find interesting. And like, even though Providence is a port, it's an industrial type port way inland. But I was also in New Bedford, which was down the road that's in Massachusetts, but on the same bay. And that's where Lizzie Borden killed her parents. And you can actually stay in the house. And that town, well, it's a little small city, has a very peculiar, even today, atmosphere about it. And again, it's more of it was traditionally a fishing port. So it seems to be the fishing ports are the ones that have the weirdest kind of energy. Again, because the nature of these men scraping by and doing an incredibly dangerous job, being away from, again, like there you go with the devil. When the woman is at home and the husband is away for weeks on end, doesn't know if he's alive or dead. She's basically in that zone. The devil will find work for idle hands to do. So there's a lot of that goes on as well. It's there's a whole. I'm not surprised there's so many ghost stories and set and horror stories set around towns like Antonio Bay and places like that.
So that's our review of The Fog, John Carpenter's The Fog. And if you know of any films that deal with hauntological aspects of the sea that might be good for us to review at a future date, then please put your suggestions in the comments below.
Like a shampoo and conditioner of the soul, like an exfoliation of the psyche. Here's Sarah with the psychic hygiene.
During these uncertain times that we still find ourselves in right now, we can feel as though we're always in a heightened state of fight or flight, which causes our bodies to fill with adrenaline, making us feel ready to engage in whatever perceived battle that we're worrying about. But when your body is flooded with this stress hormone, it can be difficult to connect with your spiritual self as fear takes the center stage. And in this state, impulsiveness, thoughtlessness, inaccurate conclusions, and overreactions are much more likely. The best way to reconnect with your spirit if you've been feeling like this during these stressful times is to simply take on the qualities of a psychic pressure cooker and gradually let off some steam. Go to the gym and hit a punch bag. Go somewhere private and scream at the top of your lungs. Get a journal and write down your anxieties and frustrations. Spare no detail. Vent until the adrenaline inside is burned up and you begin to calm down. Make no decisions while you're riled up. Stay off the phone. Stay away from sending emails. No text messages either. Wait until you have peace and clarity before you act while feeling like this. As your fears and anxieties subside, your spirit will re-emerge. So be mindful not to vent or direct your anger at innocent individuals, but instead find a neutral space to release your emotions privately. Denying or suppressing emotions like anxiety and stress can affect our overall well-being, both mentally and physically. It creates an energetic block within us in terms of psychic hygiene, and this block can disrupt the natural flow of energy within our subtle bodies, hindering our ability to connect with our intuition, inner wisdom, and higher self. It's like putting up a barrier that prevents us from accentuating our nervous system, and we become at the mercy of the external world. This can manifest as irritability, mood swings, and a general sense of unease. And it also expands to the physical body as well. Chronic stress and anxiety have been linked to various health issues, including high blood pressure, weakened immune functions, and digestive disorders. So my psychic hygiene suggestion for this week is to turn your internal pressure cooker off for a bit and release the steam. And please feel free to leave your own suggestions for blowing off steam in the comments.
Yes, that's excellent information. The fight or flight thing can be so destructive. And this ties in very well with a video that our friend Tina Kett made recently on silence is golden. You must learn to be stoic and measure yourself in order to develop yourself spiritually. So there's a lot of, not that you have to bury or crush or suppress these flows of adrenaline, high energy things, but you work with them in secrecy and silence, I think is a big part of it. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Now, we haven't been replaced by clones. I know we both know there's a continuity error. We're wearing different clothes. The reason is we recorded this over 2 nights as I had to go away for 1 day. So we had to finish up the show on a second night. On the second night, here's our second topic. And it's one that's always fascinated me, the concept of lighthouse mysteries, not necessarily just ghost mysteries pertaining to lighthouses. We're definitely following the maritime spectral thing in this episode of Hocus Pocus. Lighthouses, you think about them, all the connotations that go with them. A single tower on a rock or on a coastline somewhere, usually in a remote area, with a rotating light at the top, peering out into the darkness with an incredible responsibility of the people operating the lighthouse, responsible for the safety of so many lives. And yet we don't know the names of these people. They're only known by this beacon in the darkness. And even that is something spiritual about it. I'm not surprised that when you see paintings of lighthouses, I remember when I first saw in real life the Cape Elizabeth lighthouse that is famous from the Edward Hopper painting, and also Portland Lighthead, both in Maine. He'd really captured what those lighthouses were about. There's almost like a mystical quality. Even though he didn't paint them that way, you could feel it. Now, think about the lighthouse. It's a lot like the Wizard's Tower. The man usually, in the old days, had to ascend a spiral staircase. And the spiral usually, well, always became, the diameter of the spiral got less and less as they reached the top. So it's kind of an Orbis kind of vibe about it, meditative labyrinth kind of vibe about it. Then to go to the top, and in the old days, it would have been an oil powered lamp or early form of electricity using a big, huge incandescent bulb with huge lenses around them. Many of these lighthouses would also be on inaccessible islands or rocks that can only be supplied every so often from the mainland. And this would create a sense of remarkably, depending on how your psychology was, isolation. It could either suit you if you're that kind of monkish individual who likes the isolation, but otherwise it could often drive you mad. And laws have been changed over time because of incidents that have taken place that are quite disturbing when you hear about them, where lighthouse people went crazy. And Roger Ebert's The Film, The Lighthouse, which I reviewed on my Beyond Room 313 channel, fantastically captures that. It's a sensory overload, that film. But I also love the way the scenes are filmed, very much like the artwork of Andrew Wyatt, the way the gulls are portrayed, the lighthouse and the shore is portrayed. And that's also, again, that's Maine and New England and so on. So there's something about those lighthouses along that coast, which you spoke about in the previous part, that pertain to a hauntedness. Now we're going to talk about individual stories of various haunted and other lighthouse mysteries with Sarah and myself. But I want to mention one that's always stuck with me. It's the Seguin Lighthouse in Maine. It was a lighthouse that was commissioned by George Washington himself and was seen extremely important for the safety of ships arriving down the Gulf Stream from Europe, heading down the Gulf Stream direction, coming from Europe. And to make sure the ships going in both directions were safe and they had safe passage. Now, the island is inland, it's on land, it's not on an island. But in about 120 years ago, a young lighthouse keeper and his wife moved in there. And they were a very happy couple by all accounts. He's a handsome young man. They were, a very kind of good looking young couple. And she fell into what we call depression these days, but extreme melancholia living in the lighthouse, the cottage beside it. Well, her husband was quite happy there. He liked this job. It was well paid and he had a lot of privacy and that this kind of thing. So anyway, she fell deeper and deeper into this depression, and it really worried the man. So at great personal expense to himself, he had a piano sent to the Seguin Lighthouse because he knew that she wanted to learn piano and she had an interest in music, and he thought that this would help her deal with the boredom and melancholia. And it actually made things worse. She would be in a trance there, hammering the same notes over and over again until the point where she committed suicide. But it's also been speculated that he may have murdered her because he was being driven mad himself by her banging on the same notes over and over again inside the lighthouse. So this is the effects of both. And also the lighthouse today is now considered haunted by that woman. So you had to do the two elements there. The psychic destruction brought about by the nature of the lighthouse and someone who clearly shouldn't be living in one, coupled with the horrible tragedy that unfolded at the Seguin Lighthouse, and then the spectral appearance of her ghost. And there's also another remarkable and really disturbing phenomena with lighthouses that have been decommissioned all over the Atlantic and haven't had the doors have been locked for years. And they may even be welded up and you can't get inside because they've replaced it with a radar system or something like that. They don't need lighthouse anymore. And the light by itself starts coming on. And you have ships reporting that, when they landed, they would contact the local Marine Commission or wherever and say, is this such and such a lighthouse operational again? And they said, no, no, well, we in some other ships clearly saw the light in operation. And then they would go to the lighthouse and find that the door was welded shut or bricked up and no one could have actually got in. And also there would be no means to work it because the electrical systems are quite valuable and they'd be like sold off, as are the lenses, which are incredibly expensive, and they would have been dismantled and either sold off to another lighthouse or used on another lighthouse where they were needed. They wouldn't have been left to rot in such a, something so expensive and valuable wouldn't be left to rot inside an unused lighthouse. And so that's a very spooky one, the concept of the lighthouse lighting when nobody's there. Now you wonder what that light is, if it's a kind of jinn or some kind of spirit of someone who lived there. But we're going to talk about specific cases, not just necessarily haunted one, but strange disappearances of lighthouse keepers in the second part. So how do you feel about this topic, Sarah?
There's definitely something about lighthouses, and I do believe that a lot of it is down to the remoteness of them, and I think you have to be of a certain constitution to be able to deal with that. And I think a lot of couples that go there to man the lighthouses, like the Pearl Lighthouse that you've just brought into the conversation there, it can create a cabin fever, and I think that can drive people to do things that are out of character. And then those things, those bad things, those occurrences, they leave their own psychic imprints and residual hauntings around the lighthouse. So if people have gone out of their minds staying in these things and it's driven them to do desperate things, then the lighthouses are going to be a haven for attracting all kinds of entities to hang around them. And then there's also, like we talked about in the first section, lots of death at sea, and those deaths accumulate every year. So I believe it's possible that the lost spirits, or those who refuse to cross over properly, are attracted by the light in the darkness too, and so they congregate around those places. And like poltergeist activity, it could be like a self-perpetuating cycle where the negative energy there has an effect on the behavior of certain individuals who stay in them, and then their behavior feeds the entities that are attracted to the light in the lighthouse, and that again adds to the psychic imprint that's already there, and it just keeps going round and round and getting heavier and heavier all the time.
Now that's a very interesting concept and one I tend to agree with. But there's also the case of the Flannan Lighthouse, where the three lighthouse keepers went and completely vanished and no one had found them. Now you'd say to yourself, okay, they went nuts, they got onto a boat and they rowed off. But what's really spooky about that story is that there was a box near the lighthouse and with a metal cage around it that was no man could bend. You'd need a piece of machinery to bend the bars over, and it had been literally ripped out of the ground and bent like a gigantic machine had done it. Now, when the story first broke of the disappearance of the three men, one of them more for lights of fancy version of the story was that a sea serpent had arrived on the Flannan Lighthouse and eaten them. Now, that was, of course, completely put down. But when I hear that story of the bent over piece of metal, and you're on this island in the middle of nowhere, and we do know that we don't know what's in the sea. Well, we don't know what's in the ocean, and we don't know what's down there. And there's lots of stories of like German U-boats reporting monsters and stuff on the islands around these countries, and being even seen ships attacked by them. You do wonder if something came aground and got them. That I found that one very disturbing.
Yeah, their bodies were never found, were they? They just literally disappeared. And the story went that one of the men was quite an aggressive man, and he was prone to outbursts. He didn't get on with other people very well, and they thought that he'd had one of these episodes and just gone crazy on one of the other men, and they were fighting outside. And then the third man had gone out to stop it, and they'd all possibly lost the footing and slipped into the ocean. But again, nobody knows because nobody was there. So it's all speculation, isn't it? And
it sounds to me like a cover story, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Unless they can explain how these metal bars were bent over and there was no machinery on the island. They didn't have a tractor, they didn't have a digger, they didn't have anything, a steam tractor or anything that could have done it. And yet looked like some enormous machine or something had bent the thing over while it was heading towards the lighthouse, and as if it crawled from the sea.
And if that's the case, it was something that came out of the sea, then I'm sure, is it the Maritime Commission or the people who run the lighthouses? Is there's some kind of commission that's in charge of these buildings? Then they would know there's something untoward going on and would want a cover story for that.
In North America, they used to allow two men to man a lighthouse on an island. And what happened was sometimes a man would die and they'd have to find a way to store the body until the supply ship came along and take him to the mainland. He might have died of disease or cold or anything. And there was one particular frightening story, which was one of the basis for the movie The Lighthouse, where a lighthouse keeper, the guy, they either had a fight or the guy died somehow, and he put his body outside in a box on the rocks, waiting for the boat that never came. And every time the wind blew, the man's arms leaped up in the air as if he was beckoning the other guy to come to him into the land of the dead. It was just the wind blowing the arms, but his imagination, his paranoia, and his terror ran away with himself. And this is one of the reasons they said you have to have 3 people on a lighthouse from that point on.
It's the same kind of phenomena as people who are out at sea for months on end. Something happens to them psychologically, and they start to do desperate things and do things that are out of character. And you have to ask yourself, is it that they're just not of a strong enough constitution to be able to bear the isolation, and so they go crazy? Or is it some kind of energy or force within the water that gets to them and turns, like, I'm trying to, not like possession, but not possession, like they've been the opposite of glamorized.
Yeah, or does the stone of the lighthouse have some kind of psychometric effect upon them, where that was quarried from? You might have some of those lighthouses around these islands are very old. They're built in the 16 and 1700s, and they're still in operation, and they're all electric today. But they would have been in operation till like after World War II with the crews in them, and you would have had all the sort of the spookiness of the experiences that men had there psychometrically in those big granite stone ones, because they're very impressive. There's one out there where there's 2 of them out where Christian Morris lives in Holt. And one is the Bailey Lighthouse, which is like the lighthouse for Dublin Bay, and it's beautifully situated in a beautiful picturesque like cliffside location. And then there's a little one in the harbour, and they're really ancient. They're really ancient. And one of my earliest memories as a child is coming back from Liverpool from seeing my aunts. And in those days, the boat used to sail right into Dublin, into the Liffey. And I have such distinct memories. It's like, I can remember the buoy, or the Americans call them buoys, we call them buoys, rocking the bell back and forward in the water as the ship went by, a ding, 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 ding. And then seeing a lighthouse that was on stumps in the middle of the bay, and actually fellas working in it. How could you, we'd have the buoys outside going ding, 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 maybe the whales other nights, and then like the stars and the Milky Way, and then storms. I mean, it really is an extreme experience. Who needs to go to a convent in Tibet when you can become a lighthouse keeper?
There's something very haunting about the sounds of the sea, with the noise of the buoys and the lighthouse, the foghorn on the lighthouse. I lived in Italy for a year and lived right by a lighthouse. And from about November time to February, it was going off every night, the foghorn, and it was the most chilling, haunting sound ever, with the mist around it.
It's like a behemoth.
Yes, and it went all night. It would go off. Yes. Yes, and it was like, please make it stop, make it stop. It's horrible.
It's almost like it's summoning something from the deep.
Yes.
And in that movie, The Lighthouse, they really showed the foghorn as it was almost like a character in the film itself. And the echo, this the I mean, it's like the lighthouse, even though it's designed to protect ships, it has taken on a mystique all of its own. And you even think of things like, was the towers at Isengard and at Mordor in Lord of the Rings inspired by the by lighthouses? This kind of thing. These lighthouses were once for good and then became bad. And then you have, like, at the beginning of the Middle Earth cycle, you have the old lighthouse that used to serve Numenor, and when there was no trace, then Numenor was completely destroyed. And there were some on the fringes of Middle Earth. There were single lighters. They were inland, but they had a kind of a mystical, supernatural, almost spiritual, religious kind of aspect about them. It was like they were lighting up. They were announcing the existence of Middle Earth into ruin and the wilderness beyond. So I often wonder how Tolkien was inspired by that. What film also had a good description of madness in the lighthouse? Do you remember the day of the Triffids? The young couple, their marriage was falling apart at the beginning of the film. He was becoming an alcoholic, and that was the isolation of the lighthouse that did that.
Again, yeah, drove him to desperate measures. So it drove him to drink in that instance, and his marriage broke down. I just had a thought while you was talking about that. When you was talking about the light in the dark, on land, places like amusement arcades and shopping malls and places that have lots of light and shiny stuff around them attract lots of the wrong types of people. You get a lot of predators going around there looking to take children or to mug people or just to cause trouble in these places. Fun fairs, traveling fun fairs, places like that where there's lots of lights.
Yeah, I like that song by the Smiths, Rush Home Ruffians.
Yes.
And he describes perfectly the dangers and the horrors of the fun fair.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm wondering, is the lighthouse a spiritual or supernatural kind of example of that, in that lighthouses, it's the light that attracts all the riffraff from the spiritual realms to hang around there, and then they affect the people that are manning them.
Yeah, especially if there's no lights around of any kind for miles. And you do have entities in the sea, and you do have spirits that are trapped in the sea, and you would have like things upon the rocks. And it goes back right to the ancient world. Like, you have the lighthouse of Alexandria, which was an enormous structure, and they're actually rebuilding it because they found it in the bay. And that was like a skyscraper back in the ancient world. And even the Colossus of Rhodes, I think, was also a lighthouse as well. It was burning in his hand. And here's another one. You know what else is kind of a lighthouse? The Statue of Liberty, because there was a big light at the top of that used to guide ships in the old days through New York Harbor. Now, I can remember I used to go visit my friend in Staten Island, and the Staten Island ferry, it's 24 hours a day, and sometimes I'd come back at 3-4 in the morning, and because of the ships in the yard or the ships going into Newark, the ferry might take long detours, and sometimes it would go real close to the Statue of Liberty, and boy, was that spooky. It just was so spooky.
I think one of the reasons vast amounts of water like that are spooky is something that you said just previously. There's lots of deaths at sea. So there's we don't know how many bodies are underneath the ocean. So it's a mass grave, and none of that ground is consecrated.
No, not at all. And the sea, they're never found. The whole sea is a great. This is why in some cultures, like the Jews and the Muslims, don't eat shellfish, because they think that they fed on dead sailors at the bottom of the sea. That's why you have prohibitions. That's why shellfish are not kosher, and I think the Muslims are the same, because they believe that they've all ate them at the bottom of the sea. I always remember that film, Danny Brasco, with Al Pacino, and one guy kills a mafia guy, and he's just throwing him in the water, and he goes, "Yeah, that's where you belong, down there with the fucking crabs going through your ears and eating your eyeballs out," and all this kind of thing. And it made me think of it in a way I'd never thought of before.
Yeah, it's possible the crabs have eaten the bodies of the dead, because we don't know
Yeah.
what's down there, and we don't. I mean, I'm not saying it's true. I don't know. It's a thought, but we don't know if the fact that there's a lot of dead there in a land that's not consecrated, does that have an effect on you passing over or not? I don't know.
Well, it's supposed to, you know, it's supposed to in a lot of like cultures, you know, and then in the Aran Islands, I mentioned this in the book here, that they believe that like unknown sea creatures from the bottom of the ocean were devils. If they pulled up some kind of sea creature from the bottom of the ocean they never saw before, they would throw it back in, believing it was not. If it wasn't, you know what a lobster or crabs or things like that was, but they might now and again pull up something really weird from the bottom of the deep part of the ocean in their nets, and they actually believed it was a devil. You know, it was a devil that they were pulling up from the bottom of the ocean, and you know they would freak out and throw it right back in.
Just got a little synchronicity there. I got my cardigan here. That's from the Isle of Arran.
Aran Islands, the Isle of
Yes.
Arran, the Isle of
Sorry,
Arran,
the Arran Islands. Yeah.
yeah, the Isle of Arran's in Scotland. Yeah, you
Ah,
know
this
the
is the Irish one.
yeah, you know why they have those patrons. Each fishing family had its own patron. So
Right.
they died at sea and a cardigan washed up. They knew who it was,
Ah,
which makes
is that
family.
right?
Yeah, that's why they have those different the Celtic patrons on. They're all different. It was so if a fisherman died at sea and the cardigan washed up, it may be like the sharks ate his body, and that's washed up. They knew what's his name. You know, someone their family member had been washed up, had
That's
been eaten by a shark or something.
did not know that. Look at that.
Yeah,
How cool that is. That's the zipper pull.
yeah, yeah,
Fabulous.
yeah. There's a place in Donegal at McGee's that has like it's like a showroom of all that stuff. The clothes are absolutely beautiful, expensive, but you know they're really high quality. But they've got all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they last and last and last. You don't need 20 jumpers with that, just that you need.
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the origin of that. Kind of takes the romance out of it. That's the origin of the pattern. So you reckon they were like ID tags?
Well, next time I put it on, I shall give a thought to the dead fishermen or the men that have been washed up on the shore.
Yeah, maybe even the pattern you're using probably wasn't even a family one, but that's why they were all. Each family had a distinctive pattern.
It's,
See, because the sea brings out that kind of transcendental thinking in people, doesn't it? It brings that kind of, you know, Moby Dick. I find that story tremendously powerful. That's a very old book now. You know, it's like 17 something. And I find that book a phenomenal read. And, you know, Captain Ahab and the way he takes down St. Elmo's fire and puts into a coin to charge it or something, and then nails it to the mast to say the first man who spots Moby Dick gets his gold, the Spanish doubloon. I mean, that's pure magic, you know. That could be another aspect of the way the lights that come on at St. Elmo's fire. But then I'm thinking about it further. That's been reported a lot on the lighthouses around the Great Lakes in America and Canada. You know, like Lake Superior and Lake Huron. So that wouldn't be. I don't think you get St. Elmo's fire away from salt water. So it's an interesting theory. Maybe it is on some of the ocean-bound ones. But if you go look in art books of lighthouses, they're always whether they're Edward Hopper or Andrew Wyatt or any of those American painters. They, you know, especially what was his name? Winslow Homer. Oh my God, his paintings of the sea are like literally grimoires in themselves. And he was a guy in America who survived the American Civil War and went to live up in New England and started painting fishermen. He went to England as well. And his paintings of the sea and this they're so mystical. I saw his paintings in the years ago in the art gallery in Portland, Maine. So it's like that part of the world. Those fellas who were the artists, whether they were Winslow Homer, Wyatt, or the two Wyatts, Jamie and Andrew, or Edward Hopper, they understood the gravitas, the mystique of the lighthouse and conveyed it in painting. There's one painting by Andrew Wyatt of a comet flying behind the lighthouse, and it's probably one of the most mystical paintings ever.
I've just made a note of that because after we finish this show, I'm going to grab the history of art book out and see if I can find those. And if I can, I shall put them up as pictures on.
You'll definitely get them online and pop them in, yeah, and you know, pop them in.
And as for Moby Dick, is there a decent film regarding that story? Because
Oh
I've got a
yes,
storybook.
there was a fantastic film with Gregory Peck. I think he won the Oscar for it, and they filmed it in Dungarvan in Ireland in the 1950s. In the 1950s. Now Dungarvan today is a quaint, well kept, kind of prosperous fishing village, tourist town, but back then it was like Innsmouth or something. And it was John Huston who made the film, and he it looked just like New Bedford in Rhode Island, or sorry, Massachusetts, where the story took place. Oh, the Gregory Peck version is one of those films you have to have the DVD of. It's like so good.
I've got just want to bring in the South Stack Lighthouse from Anglesey. And that lighthouse, there is the ghost of the lighthouse keeper, Jack Jones. And he's said to be heard, which is quite strange actually, because Jack Jones is a Cockney rhyming slang for on your Jack Jones on your own.
Yeah.
So anyway, he's called Jack Jones. Maybe that's where it come from. I don't know.
No, there was a singer called Jack Jones in the 50s. I think that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Right. Anyway,
Yeah.
he said to be heard knocking on the door at night and banging on the windows. And what happened with him was in October 1853, a severe storm broke out off the coast of Anglesey, and Jack had run down the lighthouse and across the bridge which connected to the island, and a loose rock hit him on the head as he crossed the bridge. And they found him outside the lighthouse door the following day, and he died 2 weeks later. And that lighthouse now is home to his spirit, and the lighthouse was featured on an episode of Most Haunted, and apparently an object, I didn't see it, but apparently an object was flung at the host Yvette Fielding.
Yeah, there's a lot of UFO activity around that part of Anglesey. Anglesey's a funny old place as well. It's full of like megalithic sites, and remember, it was the last stand of the Druids against the Roman Empire in AD 61. So, there was like it was well, they didn't kill them all. A lot of them got to Ireland, but it was the last showdown the British, the Iceni Druids. So that whole island, as small as it is absolutely charged with magic. So I'm not surprised there's a haunted lighthouse in Anglesey. Yeah. So that's the haunted mystical lighthouse segment. Now, I'm sure all of you all over the world have stories about haunted lighthouses. Why do you think they have this mystical gravitas? Why do you think they inspired films like The Lighthouse, Roger Ebert's? Why do you think, they have this supernatural quality about them, showing them paintings and stories? And more, I think, is it because that is the shape of the building? Is it the same kind of thing maybe they were trying to achieve at the Round Towers in Ireland? This kind of thing. The meditative quality of the spiral staircase, the psychometry of the stones. But whatever it is, there's no doubt about it that there's something about the lighthouse that it's as much a metaphor as it is a safety device for keeping people safe at sea. So let us know your lighthouse stories and add them to the comments. And if you know some really good ones we don't know about, we might do a feature on them in the future.
With his keen intuition, he can sense shifts in the winds and subtle vibrations around us. So sit back, relax, kick back, and let our psychic weather whisperer guide you through the twists and turns of the upcoming cosmic climate.
Psychic whisperer, as Sarah said there, is actually very appropriate. It's gone quiet again. And this is very common. We've had this a few times on the psychic weather. Following a wild Renfield flare-up, where the Renfields go into hyper activity and they are reaching and scratching and biting and fighting and splitting all the different personalities off in different directions. They then have a kind of a collapse. They have a kind of a crash period. And so that's what we're in right now. I've noticed that all the wild ones, all the Renfields, are all like in the down at the bottom of the trench right now. They burnt themselves out. You can only have so much psychic energy that you can actually fire into these things. and when they burn them out, they crash terribly. Now, it's funny how when they crash, you'll notice if there's anyone that you know in your real life that you use as a psychic weather vane, i.e. a Renfield, one of the things you'll notice is that when they go through these crash periods, they'll become almost like, I mean, they basically deplete themselves with their, I shouldn't laugh really, because it's not particularly pleasant. They basically destroy themselves with each Renfield flare up. It's almost like, you know, the insects that, you know, die, like the way a salmon dies after having sex. It's almost like that. So they begin to die, and what happens is they. Now remember, you'll be working with some of these, and pay attention. They become like people who have been diagnosed with a terminal disease, and they will start talking about their grandiose plans for the future, because inside them they know that subconsciously a part of them has died even deeper and fallen apart even more, and they're closer to the abyss than ever. But they don't fully understand it because they don't have the wherewithal to actually read themselves. They have no introspection, and so when this happens, after the wild flare-ups, they basically fall into a kind of an abyss that there's two reactions to it. One, people around them will say, "Oh well, thank God she's stopped. She's gone nice and quiet. Don't have to deal with her tantrums or his tantrums." And then, but that'll also be followed by, "Did you hear what she said now? She wants to buy a house in like Miami. She's no money." Or she wants to go around the world. She's no money. If it's just like the people who are dying of a terminal disease, or they're going to produce a fantastic autobiography or something. That's a common one. And these people have no talent to do any of this stuff, none of it. And that's what happens to The Renfield has no ability to do any of these things, except Renfield. That's Renfielding's literally Renfield's only talent, And when that's gone, every time they Renfield, they become one stage closer to the abyss. So if you're working with someone who you're using as your own psychic barometer for Renfielding, I bet you they're in a lull right now. They're a bit down, but they're still kind of weirdly narcissistic. They will say things like, "Well, yeah, I'm planning now to, like, you know, relaunch my music career." And you're like, you only sang in the pub once 20 years ago when you were on your own. That's what Renfields are like. So we should be grateful we're in a lull. We should be grateful that the wild Renfielding all over the place has slowed down. But this is a very good time to gather data on the Renfields and also pay attention to their deterioration, psychic, physical, and so on. Mental as well, that's a given. But this is the awful price that they pay for being a Renfield, that each time they flare up, they're one step closer to the abyss. And that's a psychic weather at me, Thomas Sheridan.
Was Renfielding is like having a psychic sugar rush when you're diabetic, in the damage that it does to you.
That's a very good way of putting it. That's an excellent way of putting it. Or someone who has, like, you know, a bad drug problem and gets spends a weekend bender doing lines of cocaine. The damage to them is awful, you know, the same kind of thing. It's funny how the Renfield and the cocaine addict are kind of similar in that way. The falling apart and grandiose happens at the same time, you know, outside the Renfielding thing where they're actually going nuts and stuff like that. But there's no personality type listed in the DSM for what you would call a Renfield. I'm thinking of something like histrionic personality disorder would probably be the closest, but it's a mixture of that with borderline personality and a little bit of dissociative identity disorder. Like they don't even know who they are themselves. That's a lot of Renfielding is due to that. They don't know who they are themselves. There's a lack of inner vision, and like it's a kind of like an NPC that doesn't know they're an NPC, and that's why they Renfield.
Some people like to crack open the champagne, but here at Hocus Focus, we like to crack open the spines of the most interesting books that have graced our bookshelves over the years. It's our chance to indulge in a little show and tell, sharing the books that have inspired us and ignited our imaginations. Our hope is to provide you with some fresh ideas and inspiration for your next read. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of our Fortean bookshelf. And my book this week is Tales of Witches and Sorcery by Ken Radford, which is a collection of stories and folklore about witches and sorcery. And some of the stories in here are recorded from historical events such as the Salem witch trials, while others in the book are just spoken word through the art of storytelling passed down through the generations. The storytelling in the book lets us walk in the same footsteps that our ancestors did and gain insight into the beliefs, fears, and superstitions that once dominated society. As well as the stories in the book, there are over 50 illustrations, including woodcuts and drawings of times when witch hunts were rampant. And it includes stories from the 14th century all the way up to the 1940s. Now, last week in our Mysterious Portals segment, Thomas mentioned the rollright stones in the Cotswolds and in the UK. And it was that actually that inspired me to grab this book off the bookshelf, because inside it there's a story about the stones. And legend tells how long ago an invading king and his retainers stood on the ridge and they were confronted by a witch of Shipton under Witchwood. And she cast a spell which where the invaders were turned to stone. And the Kingston was put below the crest of the mound, and all his men were put in a circle behind him. And the mystery, which for thousands of years has surrounded the rollright stones, still persists today. And in the 1800s, there was a young wife from the village of Snows Hill, and she wanted a child, and a longing for this child made her very sad. And at that time in the village, there was an old widow who had discovered many of nature's secrets with herbal remedies to cure the villagers that were ill. So the young wife went to see the old lady to tell her of her troubles, and the widow remembered a remedy never known to fail, and she asked the young wife to return at nightfall. So the young wife snuck out into the night and went back to the old widow's cottage, and they walked up long Compton Hill, approaching the hilltop from the east. And when they reached the summit, the whispering night stones stood there all black against the sky, and they spoke in hushed voices, pointing to the stone sentinels. And together they stood there in the moonlight, and the wife was told to take her clothes off and stand naked against the kingstone, which she did. She did as she was told, and she pressed her body so close that she was chilled by the stone's touch, and she stood pressed against the kingstone in silent homage. And as she stood there, she was murmuring her wishes and her desires to it, that she wanted a child. And the old widow smiled in satisfaction, and it was a ritual, apparently, that always came to pass, a promise foretold by the whispering nights. Now, no one will ever know whether that night the rollright stones changed the young wife's destiny, but in the years to come, she was blessed with grandchildren to comfort her in her old age, all born from her 3 sons. So this book is a great compendium of tales surrounding the ancient craft, the old ways, and even some megalithic mysteries.
Wow, that rollright stones certainly has some baggage when it comes to all kinds of manner of spooky stuff that's been going on for generations, centuries, and it's still going on to this century. And right up to the 1980s, there was still like, there's something about that place. There's something about us. I felt very strange there. And I was very happy when, I think it was Neil Rushton at the Mysterious Air Conference, said that there was a very sinister feeling to the rollright circles. I completely agree. There's something not right about that spot. And it seems to have a negative energy or entities attached to it.
Never
Very
been to
nice.
the rollright stones, but I do remember Neil talking about them at the Mysterious Earth. Now you mention it.
Yeah, they're. I think I've got a film on them or something. But yeah, I covered them in my book, The Druid Code. They have very strange anomalies connected to them. And in our own book, a murder mystery connected to them in the 1940s, involving a cult. My book this week, speaking of the 1940s, is Dion Fortune's The Magical Battle of Great Britain. Now, I know we recently did a show on Dion Fortune, but I actually think this is my favorite book of hers. What it is a series of reports on magical workings by her and the fraternity of inner light between 1939, when the annexation of when Hitler invaded Poland, all the way to the vernal equinox of 1944. Now, every time they had a meditation trying to create a supernatural force to combat the supernatural force of Third Reich, she wrote down very, very good notes. And if you want to know a lot about meditations, the kind of magical functioning she was involved in, the process, a very, very good magical journal. And I would actually say, in terms of usefulness, you'll get more out of Dion Fortune's philosophy from this than you get about just anything else, because she's using very descriptive language to explain to the other people involved in the rituals what it's about, why it's done. There's lots of things regarding channeling and downloads and so on like this, and highly recommended. You don't even have to like Dion Fortune stuff so much to get a lot out of this book. It's extremely interesting. And just, for my own book, Valpurgis Night, shows you that, like, there were people, not just Dion Fortune, but Lewis Spence, and even the London, operations group, who actually knew that there was something supernatural and spiritual going on with the Third Reich as part of their warfare. So highly recommended. Dion Fortune, The Magical Battle of Britain.
I bet that's really good. If that's as good as her psychic self-defense, then that would be really good, because I know her writing is quite old-fashioned for the time now, quite difficult to read sometimes, but you forget about that because the subjects are always so interesting.
The guy who put it together, person who put it together, I can't remember the name. It's tiny text on it. Gareth Knight has put an excellent footnotes, appendices, and descriptive things of the stuff. So it couldn't be easier to work your way through. I actually think it's more useful than psychic attacks for that reason, because it gives you a better grounding in modern language into her work. Highly recommended.
Does it go into both the meditations, the letters and the meditations, and the work that they did on the White Cliffs of Dover when they stood on the cliff edge? Because that was two separate magical workings, wasn't it, they were doing?
Yeah, but they did all that. It's all in here. And some weren't even done on it. Some were done on houses and things like this. The whole thing was basically, they were trying to, she channeled higher powers, what ascended masters, as she called them, for assistance in defending England from the German invasion, to turn back the bombers. Now, by 1944, in the vernal equinox, the Battle of Britain was over, basically, and the Germans were on a defensive all the way back to Berlin, because it stopped it's in March 94, so it stopped a few months before D-Day. And there was no doubt anyway that the Germans were not in any position to, they weren't even interested in invading Britain. That was a myth. And so, yeah, it's all in there. The whole I read this when it first came out, and it's about, I don't know, about 10, 15 years old. It's great. It's a great read. You learn a lot from it. You learn a lot about the magic process.
She got sick not long after, didn't she?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Gerald Gardner was the one particular magical work, and Gerald Gardner was the only survivor.
Yeah.
Killed the other two.
Does make you wonder, did it take something out of them? They had to put too much of themselves into it.
Well, that's what Gardner said. That's what Gardner said. They were invoking things like King Arthur and stuff like that. They were very heavily involved in Arthurian elements and archetypes. Yeah, that's what happened. They were older guys, but literally killed.
You have to be very, very careful what you're invoking and what you're doing, don't you?
Well, it was World War II, that's what they were up against, Yeah. It's kind of like us and the Rona. We were up against it too. And I used my own magical battle against the Rona, and so did many of us. The thing is that there was more of us these days than there was back then, so I think we got success quicker.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was big groups of us, wasn't there? All really came together through your car blogs. We all kind of found each other Whereas with Dion Fortune and Gerald Gardner and the other man, I forget his name,
Yeah.
three of them on their own, and even then they had to keep it quiet for fear of getting arrested or locked up for witchcraft.
Yeah, or even espionage, they had to be very careful.
Yeah.
So, but because there's a lot, I think the actual shamanic army gathered around the time Hillary Clinton was running for the magical army that we have today in the world gathered in order to prevent Hillary Clinton from becoming US president. And we did that. And I think that we've been at war with them ever since then.
Yeah, we tend to use memes now, don't we, as well?
Yeah, but I even seen Keck is making a comeback now, Pepe. So there's a funny meme tonight about him not fully reincarnating and actually manifesting back on this earth again in time for the latest round. So it's wonderful stuff. Yeah, we used memes as our spells and we're extremely successful. And we will continue to be successful because our adversaries can't meme.
It's that time again where we say thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed tonight's seafaring episode. And if you did, please share far and wide. You're our only form of advertising and your sharing helps us to expand. And I have a bonus for you tonight. I've been working on something which I will upload and schedule for around 10:15, which will give you time to stretch your legs and have a cigarette, have a break, whatever you need to do. So please stay tuned for that. It's a little something I've crafted together called The Witching Hour. And as you've probably guessed from the title, it'll be about an hour in length. And I promise it will be very complimentary for winding down for the night after this show.
Well, I'll certainly be looking forward to that. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for keeping the show going. The numbers on Sarah's broadcast was last week. This will also be on Sarah's again. I don't know when I'll be back on my channel. Maybe it should be fairly soon. I think maybe. But Sarah's kind of manning the ropes for a while. And so thanks for that, Sarah, especially tonight as I'm not feeling well. And don't forget, we have the merch. We have a book coming out soon. And Sarah's film after the broadcast, what you're watching right now. So before we wrap it all up, Sarah, hit me with that tarot.
Yes. The tarot of the week this week is the 10 of Wands. And it's a card, shows a picture of a person carrying a heavy load of 10 wands on their journey towards a nearby town. Now, this burden is so big that it obstructs their view of the road ahead, yet they push on, driven by their determination, but not really sure where they're going. Kind of know how he feels a little bit. The blue sky above and the clear path beneath show that the outcome for this unnecessary pressure will be a good one if they lighten the load. So in life, this card refers to situations where somebody, it might be yourself, somebody you know, appears to be managing an overwhelming amount of stuff effectively, but it's blocking their view, and the weight might be preventing you from seeing your own life's direction clearly because you're trying to handle too much at the same time. The 10 of Wands can signify shouldering the burdens of others. Perhaps you're someone who takes on the responsibilities of others and makes them your own. In that case, the 10 of Wands can represent burdens that aren't inherently yours, but are things that you're carrying on your shoulders because you can't say no, really. Maybe you don't like to say no and are now in a situation where people are taking advantage of that. This card often can signify feeling drained and exhausted from these responsibilities that you've taken up upon yourself. And sometimes we become so engrossed in solving other people's problems that our own paths become neglected. And the message here tonight is to let go of some of these burdens and prioritize your own needs, at least until you reach your own personal goals. It's important to find a balance between helping others and caring for yourself. And as I said, the blue sky signifies that this extra load that you're carrying is only temporary, and you will find relief only if you acknowledge that you're stretching yourself too thinly. So remember, focus on your own goals so you can get where you need to be with both clarity and vigor.
Well, that card has another side to it. It's a bit dark as well. It's the card of oppression. I think it's called oppression on the top deck. And that's when you accumulated a lot of power to be careful not to be throwing your weight around. So you have the 10 of Wands, be careful. So it's often sometimes that card artwork is the sign that here he is coming to the town that may have besmirched him when he was younger. And he's come back and he's elected as a politician or a conquering tyrant. And he's coming back to say, oh, it's payback time, mothers. And so it's a card that warns about that when if you attain your goals and you attain your desires, don't use them to batter down or oppress others or build a prison for them. So it's a warning against tyrannical behavior in the aftermath of your well-earned and accumulated success. It's about, it's a young man going to town. He's bringing home the fruits of his success. He's burdened by his success, but he's also has the potential to be a bit of a thug because he has everything he needs now.
Which way you would go with that then would if he was doing a reading would determine which other cards came out with it, really.
Yeah, because on their own, the cards mean very little. It's readings that determine. I mean, people say to me over the years, I got this card, what does it mean? Absolutely nothing. I'd have to see what else was there. Yeah, you can't tell a whole plot. You can't say you looked at one page in a book and said I read the whole book.
Yeah. No, these what we do with this tarot of the week is just a general kind of
maybe down the road we'll look into readings.
Yeah.
And and we'll do a proper show on the tarot in terms of readings and stuff, different kinds of ways of approaching it. But yeah, always remember that the card is only one page in a story. It's not the only page in the story. Good night, everybody.
Good night, and see you after this for the next for the witching hour.
Woohoo, the witching hour. Bye, everybody. Bye, Sarah.
Bye.